everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 2 of the 2025 Spring Mini Skein mini series. Tonight, we are gonna play around with some color mixing and look at different shades of deep magenta and Caribbean blue by mixing them with black. These are two primary colors that I use for most of my color mixing because you have more options. You can create more colors if you start with a cyan, magenta, yellow palette than you can if you're doing a red, blue, yellow palette, because you can't mix the cyan or the magenta if you're starting with either red or blue. But you can mix the red and blue from cyan and magenta. Now, as of Hanukkah a few years ago, I had looked at all the shades of some classic rainbow colors when, mixing those with black, looking at different depths of shade of those colors, and I refer to these images all the time. So it's beyond time to do this with Dharma Acid Dye's Deep Magenta and Caribbean Blue. Let's go make some dye stocks of our Caribbean Blue and black so we can set up our first color mixing. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so I could start making dye stocks of our True Black and Caribbean Blue acid dyes. To make the 1% stock solutions, where we want to have a concentration of 1 gram of dye dissolved in each 100 milliliters of water, I measured out 1.5 grams of the True Black acid dye to dissolve that in a final volume of 150 milliliters, and I measured out 2.5 grams of the Caribbean Blue acid dye to dissolve that in a final volume of 250 milliliters. I know I'm gonna need more black once I go to do our pink and black grid, but since I'll be setting that up on a different day, it makes sense to have fresh dye stocks for doing these projects. The one thing that I will note is that when you are measuring out larger volumes, you can be more precise in those measurements. So if I was making 1 liter of the stock solution, the margin of error would be smaller than when I'm making only 150 milliliters of the stock solution. But there are a few different places where error can come into play with these calculations. Which I'm bringing up is because small amounts of error with measurements is something that can make more of a difference when you're dealing with color mixing than it might when you're dealing with the absolute amount of dye on your yarn. We're gonna set up our grid, so we will be varying either the pink or blue as we go across the columns, where each column will have half the amount of dye as the one next to it. And then in the rows, we're gonna vary the amount of black, where the bottom row has the most, and we decrease the amount of black dye by half as we go up and up the rows. Now the top row will not have any black because this will give us a little bit of a sense of what the original color looks like. So that way we also have that depth of shade of deep magenta or Caribbean blue to refer back to. When I do more triangle color mixing exercises, I try to have it set up so that way I have the exact same amount of dye in each of our samples. So in all of them, we would have a 1% depth of shade or 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. But today, you can tell because we have dye stocks and we're adding different amount of dyes to each of the samples, we're not going to have a consistent depth of shade across the board. At the highest, we will have a 1.5% depth of shade, where we have the 1% of either our pink or blue and a 0.5% depth of shade of our black. But then the rest are going to vary. Now, there will be multiple samples here that have the same proportion of our pink and blue to the black, but you're going to be seeing those at different total depths of shade, which can be really helpful because sometimes when you're looking at a color really saturated, you don't get as much of a feel for some of those undertones and subtle notes as you do when you're looking at a less saturated version of the color, which is why I enjoy this exercise and find it to be incredibly helpful. We have 25 cups here, each with 1 cup of water, no acid yet. We want to add the acid after we've already added the yarn. And now we're going to start adding dye. Starting with our blue, we're going to add 20 milliliters, 10, 5, 2.5, and then 1.25 milliliters. And then with our black, we'll have 0, and then 10 milliliters, 5, 2.5, and 1.25 to give us that mixture on the grid that I showed you before. Remember when I talked to you a little bit about error before. I am doing my best to measure things out consistently, but every time you measure something, there's a chance to introduce more error into your measurement. That's why it's best, whenever possible, to use a measuring tool that is closest to the volume you want to measure as possible. So I'm using a 20 milliliter syringe to measure out 20 milliliters, 10 to measure 10, 5 to measure 5, and then I happen to have a 3 milliliter syringe to measure out both the 2.5 milliliters and then the 1.25 milliliters. Now measuring out both of these colors is a little tricky because the dye is so dark and opaque that sometimes it's a little hard to see in the syringe, but I find that if I look at the syringe with nothing in it and move to the measurement I want, look at where the top of the black seal on the syringe lands, that can help me measure to the correct space if the liquid is looking to be a similar color as the black top of the syringe piece. Now, what do I mean about introducing less error when you measure once? If I was going to use the 5 milliliter syringe to measure out 20 milliliters of liquid, if I got to 5.1, 5.2, 4.8, that error would propagate each time I measure it out. But if I was going to have a 0.2 milliliter error each time I measured out with the 20 milliliter syringe or the 5 milliliter syringe, then percentage-wise the error is bigger the more times you do it. Again, I hope I'm not making anyone's eyes glaze over, but I do try to be as precise as I can. So when I'm stirring them, I can see a bit of the color, so I can see that I still see tinges of blue down here. But looking on camera right now, it just looks like a sea of black except for those 3 colors. I promise there are more colors in here. But I'm bringing over the pre-soaked Platinum Fingering Weight mini skeins. And let's do this diagonal at first. This diagonal where the amount of blue is decreasing and the amount of black is increasing. Ooh, that's a nice navy right there. Ooh, so our deepest one is looking a little bit black, but sometimes colors shift as we add acid and wait over time. But it's fun to just get a sense. This color right here is beautiful. Because what would that be? A 0.25% depth of shade of Caribbean blue. And I guess a 0.125% depth of shade of black. But this whole diagonal is a quite lovely blend of the 2 colors. All right, I'm gonna carry on and add the rest of the yarn here. You may notice that there are times when I wipe my spoon in between going between different containers and times when I don't. If I'm going from a container with less dye to a container with more dye, I don't wipe the spoon off in between because that's not really going to alter the total amount of dye in the next one. But the reverse way, it could make more of a difference. If I had the spoon in the 1% depth of shade container and went down to the 0.625% depth of shade container, that little bit of dye in the drops on the spoon could really impact the amount of color we have on our lightest blue. Oh, I always love doing these squares, mainly because it's always like that there's a light shining over here because it's so much brighter up here and so much deeper as we go down. Now, Caribbean blue is a color that can be a little bit more slow to absorb, so it's possible I may need to do some heat setting within these containers. It'll be quite the difference when we eventually get to the pink. But now I just need to add acid to each of the containers. And I'm gonna go ahead and do 2 teaspoons of white vinegar to each container. I think that that's a good plan. And after I added the vinegar, I then went ahead and stirred things up. And then I popped lids on all of these containers so that way we could set everything aside for a couple of days to let this color slowly set. because ideally, if all the color absorbs onto the yarn, I can steam set things in bigger batches than otherwise I would be able to do. We have under 50 milliliters left of our black dye and under, I would say, 75 milliliters left of our blue dye. And since I want to leave no dye behind, I decided to dye some extra skeins of yarn. I filled a pot over halfway full with water, added in our black dye and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar, and then added a skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn that's 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, and swish that is 100% superwash merino, and moved that around before bringing it to the stove to heat it up. After a little bit of time, a lot of the black dyes will have absorbed into the yarn. So then I briefly removed the yarn, added the blue dye, stirred things up, and then added the yarn back in to continue heating for 30 minutes. This will give us a really pretty layered tonal, and I know the color is going to be awesome because of the colors that we had just mixed before. Once I was done heating the yarn, I set it aside to cool completely and washed it off camera. There was a little bit of blue left in the dye bath when I was done heat setting the yarn, and you know what? Sometimes you want to leave a little bit behind because that will make the washing a little easier. I found with Caribbean blue specifically, sometimes if there's blue that isn't setting, if you leave it behind, the washing is easier after the fact. I set everything up on Friday afternoon, kept it indoors because it's still cold outside all weekend, and now first thing Monday morning, I'm removing the lids so we can look at the yarn. I'd say from the camera point of view, it doesn't look like there's a huge difference on the bottom between our most black with our least blue and our most black with the highest amount of blue, but there is definitely a difference in here. It's just subtle, and differences like this will probably become a little more obvious once the yarn is dry. Now, we do have blue, it looks like blue and black that's left over here. Let me quickly remove the other two from our highest amount of blue. There is color left in all the containers, with the most in here with the black, but the blue does seem to get lighter and lighter. We're probably near like a saturation limit of our colors over there. And again, there is contrast between those colors. We'll be able to see that better once it's dry. Now, if the color looked a lot darker than that pale blue that's left over, then I might go ahead and decide to steam set the yarn in these containers so it can absorb more of the color. You can see like these ones are looking nice and clear. That's good. It's really just the deepest blues. But I know that, oh, and that one looks great. Not very much color in over here as well. It's really just where the blue is the most pigmented. I'm gonna actually leave that color behind, and we may go ahead and use all that on 100 grams of yarn just to show you how little color there really is left there. Now, if these colors were less pigmented, then I would want to steam set them on their own, away from touching each other, but I don't think them touching each other is going to result in any color transfer from one to the next. So, especially because they all have the same amount of blue. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these in my steamer basket. Eventually, I will add a zip tie to keep each column together. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and add that second column in the steamer basket as well. And I'm going to steam set this for 30 minutes. I feel like on camera, it's not picking up how teal some of these blends are, which surprised me. It's definitely leaning more teal than navy, which I suppose makes sense. There's less pink in this blue in terms of like comparing this to like a primary blue, which you can get by mixing a cyan with some magenta. But anyway, I'll see you after 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, things are nice and steamy. And to avoid tangling the yarn, I am making sure to pick up the mini skeins, trying to grab each one in its entirety. and carefully setting them aside until they are cool enough that I can add on zip ties. Oh, cause see there, I picked that up and a little more came. I'm just paying close attention to try to not snag it. Obviously a zip tie on at that point would be better, but I wanted to try to avoid, I don't know, things touching too much. But the rest of the yarn I went ahead and put on zip ties because I think that the containers were mostly clear, and then popped them into the steamer basket to steam set for 30 minutes. One reason why it is super handy to do cold process like this is that I can set up 25 samples at once and then heat set it a lot faster. If I wanted to heat set each of these containers, maybe I could only do 3 to 5 at a time, and it would just take longer to deal with. You'd want the containers to cool a bit before removing them because you can steam in these takeout containers. That's worked fine in the past. So the whole process can just take a lot longer, which is fine, but sometimes not ideal, and this works well for me, especially once the summer heat starts coming and I can pop them outside for the cold processing step. I dyed 100 grams of yarn in these leftovers because the leftovers here were from dyeing 200 grams of yarn, and the resulting blue we have here is lighter than the 0.0625% depth of shade that is our lightest blue with no black. Significantly lighter than that, showing that there is very, very little pigment left over. We're gonna wash the 2 sets that are the most likely to be bleeders. And if this goes well, then I might wash the other ones off camera. I will say for the Leave No Dye Behind skeins that I dyed with the leftovers, that had no bleeding when I washed it. And so that was really good. Now, we've had some dish soap. We have a little bit of some color coming out. But honestly, it's really, really not bad. And I'm gonna add even more soap. We're washing on cold. And as I fill that up, once again, this is the yarn that was with that leftover color that was left behind. Not enough dye to make a difference on even one of the 20 gram mini skeins here. Don't worry, I'll try to show that at the end with the dry yarn as well. All right, we are seeing some very light blue bleeding. Not a surprise given this color, but I'm gonna fill this up again. All right, let's see. So soap, it's not that soap causes bleeding, but you're more likely to see it with soap and with warm water. That's why we recommend washing yarn dye with acid dyes on cold. So this amount is not something that I'm worried about. If I saw bright blue, I would be a lot more concerned. I'm gonna go ahead and wash this a few more times off camera and then pop back in. Okay, a few rinses later, and it's definitely better. There's still like a hint of something, but you can really barely see it. And again, this is not something that concerns me very much. So while I go ahead and pop that yarn into the spin dryer, I'm just going to quickly wash the remaining blue yarn here on camera so you can see how much or how little, really I'm expecting how little blue we see come off of the 300 grams of yarn that was remaining. Now let's transition to shades of deep magenta and mix that awesome pink with black. We're starting the exact same way we did with the blue. I'm making 2 1% stock solutions using 1.5 grams of true black and 2.5 grams of deep magenta in 150 or 250 milliliters of liquid respectively. Then I set up my 25 cups, each with 1 cup of water and no acid in them, and then started adding our dyes to each cup, using between a total of 30 milliliters or as little as 1.25 milliliters, depending on which cup it is. I'm setting this up the same way I did with the blues, it's just I'm using deep magenta instead of Caribbean blue. Now, deep magenta is a pink pigment, also a primary color, but it tends to strike to yarn pretty quickly, and I think it's one that could be really good for glazing yarn. So I'm not anticipating that we're gonna have color, a lot of color left over in the containers, maybe a tiny bit of black, but I'm expecting the various dye baths to clear very nicely. And maybe we could get some breaking, but maybe not. The yarn we're using here is the same fiber content as what I used on the blue. It's just DK weight instead of fingering weight, but it's still 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And given that it's the same line from the same supplier, I expect that they behave very similarly. I added the yarn, and then for good measure, I added 2 teaspoons of white vinegar to each container, stirred things up just like I did with the blue. I don't think we really need that much, but given that we have at the highest, a 1.5% depth of shade, when we have a 1% depth of shade of our pink and a 0.5% depth of shade of the black, having a little more acid in there isn't gonna hurt anything. I am so excited to compare mixing the cyan and magenta with black to the red and the blue, even though I haven't done this with a true primary red or blue, but in general, reds have more yellow in it and primary blues have more pink in it. I don't know if that's the definition of warm versus cool, but yeah, I think that some of the, especially like deeper colors mixed with black, could be really helpful for, say, when you want to get and mix like a cranberry color, because all of these over here feel a lot more Merlot than cranberry red. You would need some more yellow in there, and so you could add yellow to one of these, or you could go with a red that you're mixing. But I would say that we've got some amazingly gorgeous pinks in here, and I'm super, super excited. I popped on the lids and then set everything aside overnight, but more likely for a couple of days. The cold processing takes a little longer at room temperature than it might if I can put things outside on an 80-degree day where it's in the sun and can really warm up. And so I'm just gonna see you in a couple days. I had some leftover dye baths from earlier today. One was that leftover pastel blue, and another was some other tonals I was dyeing for a customer. And so I took the remaining pink and black dyes that I had mixed up, combined them, and added 200 grams of yarn, 1 skein of Stroll, 1 skein of Swish, moved everything around. The yarn was dry to start, so I tried to move it pretty well. Both of those yarn bases are ones that are very absorbent, and so they soak up water quickly. And then I took it to the stove to bring it up to just below a simmer, let it heat for 30 minutes, and then washed it off camera. 2 days later, and let's go set up the grid again so we can look at these colors. So right now, there's not a lot of definition between the pinks across the rows. I mean, there are in the top too, but I'm really curious to see how these 2 darkest ones come out. Let's see. All right, we have a tiny bit of pink over there. That's not bad. Oh, there's a big difference. Yeah, you can see on camera, this one is way more cool toned. I'm glad that made a difference even there. So because there was some color in this row over here, just like what I did with the blue, I don't think there's even gonna be enough left for me to do a tonal with it, but I think I'll probably go ahead and steam set things by columns and do this one by itself. I guess these 2 by itself, and then those 3 all together. Yeah, that one with the black has just a bit more color, but that's so much less than the blue we had, so I'm not even gonna try to dye some yarn with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the yarn. As I mentioned, put it into the steamer basket, steam set things for 30 minutes, and then I'm gonna wash this off camera, but I'll pop back in if I notice any light or heavy bleeding when I go ahead and wash it. I did find it interesting as I removed the last few minis that we had a little bit more black left over than pink compared to our blue square. But we still got really good absorption of all of these colors. I now have plans to set up one final square. I mixed up our black and pink dye stocks off camera the same way I did for this last square. And then starting again with 1 cup of water in each of our containers, I added dye in the same proportions I just did. The difference here with this square is the yarn. We've got Crazy 8, Yak, Diamond, Zebra, and then the Gold Sparkle. I'm adding a different yarn base in each row or column to show that when you're setting one of these up, you really want to do the same yarn base for all of the colors, so that way you can have a good comparison. Because if I'm looking at a Yak blend, the colors are going to look very different from if I'm using a quote zebra yarn base that has a mixture of white and black yarn in the base versus another off-white bare yarn or even one with silk blend in it. This can alter the way those colors are perceived a bit. And therefore you might need to tweak your recipes depending on the colors that you're using. And so I'm mostly just doing this for fun. This square is not particularly informative, except when we get this yarn dry and compare it to the last square we did. So I let everything here sit for 24 to 48 hours, just like I had with the other samples, and then removed the yarn to set it aside and steam set. And we'll take a closer look at this when we go and do the conclusions. I've now officially dyed all the mini skeins I'm going to be dyeing in this video, but there is still another dyeing project I want to do. And I want to dye some sock blanks inspired by this type of grid color mixing. And I actually decided to dye the sock blanks in 2 different ways. So let's go take a look. I decided to do 2 different sock blanks inspired by our mini skein sets today. For the first, I started with 16 cups of water, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar, 25 milliliters of a 1% stock solution of Dharma's True Black, and then 1 double-stranded sock blank that's 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And I dip dyed this sock blank into the black dye to give us a bit of a gradient from light to dark. The black wasn't absorbing as fast as I had anticipated, so I did bring over a yarn mop to help soak up the excess black dye before adding in the blue. But I waited until I was satisfied with the color of the blank to do that. And added 25 milliliters of Caribbean Blue, an older 1% stock, but still a stock solution of this color. And this time, instead of dip dyeing the blank into the blue, I added the entire blank into our dye bath and stirred things up to get that blue all over in a more even way. And this corresponds to one of the columns that we see on our squares, where the black varies in each sample, but the blue remains the same. Now, obviously, I could have dip dyed one end into the blue and one into the black, but this is more similar on a blank to what we have with the minis. It's just our gradient and transitions are going to be a little smoother. I let everything heat for 30 minutes, and then I removed the blank to set it aside to cool so I could wash it off camera. For the next sock blanks, I decided to do things differently. Once again, I started with 25 milliliters of our True Black dye in a fresh dye bath of 16 cups of water with 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. And this time I went to dip dye the blank, but I'm dip dyeing it widthwise. So that way, as we go across the rows of the blank, we'll have one side that is almost black, one side that is mostly white with some grays in the middle. Now, I only dip dyed the blank until I was satisfied with the color that was in there, and then I added more black dye and did the same thing on a second blank. I knew I wasn't going to exhaust the dye that was in the dye bath. I planned to add a yarn mop at the end to soak up the rest of that black dye before we go ahead and transition into dyeing some pink. I added 25 milliliters of pink and then started dip dyeing the blank lengthwise the way I might normally do it. And I feel like things are striking a bit slower than normal, especially with the black and the pink. Maybe, did I not add as much acid this time? I don't know, but either way, I'm able to get really good coverage of our pink gradient onto the yarn. And when I was satisfied with the coverage of the pink, I did remove the blank entirely and then added some more pink dye and dip dyed the second blank before also removing that one and bringing over the yarn mop to soak up the rest of the pink dye. Now, because I didn't heat the blank that long here in the pot, I will go ahead and steam set them in a steamer basket for 30 minutes just to make sure that we have all the dyes really well set before removing the yarn to let it cool and washing it off camera. Here are all of the mini skeins that we've dyed in this video. I think we have 75 20-gram minis here. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start twisting things up so I can recreate our squares. Here are the 25 blues that we got from mixing Caribbean Blue and True Black. And I love how these came together. Because this is a cooler toned blue, then I guess I did this with extreme blue once, not really a primary. It gives us some really beautiful differences from doing that other blue. I would say the things here that are notable are that we definitely have a difference between our bottom two corners. When they're far away, it does look really subtle, but there is a definite difference here. And this deep color is more of like an ocean blue, slightly leaning teal, versus say a navy. And then here we have just a really beautiful cool toned gray. This color right here, I think, is a great option for a gray. It does lean a hair blue, but I think that there's a lot of warmer grays out there, and so I really like this mixture. Before washing, I had bundled things in columns here, mainly because I was concerned about the blue bleeding, and I figured that if we have color transfer, it's the same amount of blue in each column, whereas if I had put a row together, some of the blue from the deepest could bleed onto the lightest. But you absolutely could create sets like this by rows. From far away, it's not as obvious the difference that we have in here, where we vary the amount of blue but not the black, mainly because I think that the intensity of the color is very similar, but the blue percentage, which does increase as we go that way, which almost feels like we have like a desaturation filter coming down towards me over here. But we can also separate things by columns, which from far away, we seem to have more contrast in here because in every case, things are going from something much lighter to something much more saturated because of the addition of the black. And that doesn't always feel as obvious when we looked at the rows. So looking between the two, which do you prefer? A lot of the trends that were present with the blue combinations are present here where we mixed deep magenta and true black. Especially when we get down to the more saturated sections of black, the changes are much more dramatic when we increase the black than they are when we increase the magenta. And I'll add what it looked like to mix a red with true black up here at similar proportions, just so that way you can see as a comparison to some of these mixed shades, which lean way more berry and plum as we get down to the deepest colors, versus when mixed with red, we ended up with colors that were a lot more burgundy. These are the two darkest blacks with the lightest pink and the deepest pink. And you can see we've got a very nice berry color. It is not close to a crimson or a maroon. It is definitely way more pink. It's way more cool toned. I'm also enjoying these grays a lot. Now this one still leans a bit purple, but it's definitely warmer, obviously. I mean, it's a pink versus a blue than what we had at a similar position with our cyan. These colors are so pretty. And I mean, I know that I might say, okay, this is 25 different colors, and I'll be corrected in that they're shades, because I guess when you add black or white, it's a shade versus like the hue from when you mix different colors in. But playing around with colors like this can really help you, especially if you have limited colors, limited premixed colors in your kit to start with. And Dharma has, what, 80 some different colors? But even there, they're not a lot of muted gray mixed shades in there. A lot of the premixed colors have a lot more vibrancy to them. And so I think playing around with this is really helpful for getting a sense of what proportions you may want to mix the colors if you want something that is a little bit moodier and less bright. Of course, even starting cold with no acid, we do have evidence of color breaking in here as the colors strike at different rates. And so that is something else you need to consider when you're mixing colors, and that the different pigments you mix may bind at different rates to your yarn. And so you just need to be prepared to account for that. For our mixed yarn bases, I had to go back and double check that I had things in the correct order. Because here we have our sparkle blend, our zebra base, our silk blend, yak blend, and then 100% superwash merino. And I really had to check because I would say that the sparkle looks like, I don't know, it's like a toss-up between which of these two feels darker, which is one of the reasons why I did this. The zebra base has that black strand in there, making this skein appear deeper than this one, even though this one has more pigment in it. And it's not a huge surprise that our silk blend here feels a lot lighter than the yak blend because the yak base was darker to begin with. But I really wanted to exaggerate the reason why it's really important when comparing different depths of shade on yarn, that you're comparing the same yarn base to itself. And we'll compare this whole grid next to the grid that was all on our Platinum DK base, and then I'll lay them out straight so that way we can compare the yarn bases and the mixed colors a little bit clearer. The comparison between the two laid out like this looks way more similar than it did in the square, but let's zoom in on the two biggest differences. And those would be our diamond sock versus the Platinum DK, and our that yak versus the Platinum DK. Now the fact that a yak blend will look different than a merino nylon blend, that one is pretty obvious because the bare yarn looks so different to start with. But the silks being different with the same recipe can be a little more surprising for people. Now on this channel, I've done a lot of comparisons of silk blends versus non-silk blends. And so if you've been watching for a while, then it's not a surprise that a yarn with silk with the exact same amount of dye is going to look less saturated. In general, silk needs more pigment for it to have the same visual color in the end as a non-silk blend. Each of these yarns have the exact same recipe and therefore the exact same depth of shade. And that's why the depth of shade or the proportion of dye to the amount of fiber or yarn that you're dyeing, it is a comparison of one color to itself on the same yarn base. And so the total number of grams of dye and that depth of shade doesn't necessarily tell you something about the finished colorway. I dyed two different sock blank colorways, and we'll look at those one at a time. This first sock blank had the same amount of blue all over, and then we dip dyed into our black. And I would say that of the mini skein sets, I think it's the most similar to this one right here, which is not that much of a surprise. I'll have to double check how much blue I used, but here we have a zero. Ooh, I think this is more blue. I think that the amount of blue is probably more similar to here. I think I used 1/4 gram of dye, but I don't remember. But you can see how these colors of these mini skeins match up onto this blank pretty well. So since these colorways are so similar, why might you pick to dye this type of gradient transition on mini skeins versus on a sock blank? If we were to unravel the blue to black sock blank, we would get gradient yarn that would have fairly smooth transitions between the different colors. Yes, we might have some reverse speckles in there, but overall, you wouldn't need to weave any loose ends when you're transitioning between colors because the yarn is going to do that for you. The mini skeins don't have any of that reverse speckling, but they do have a harsher transition between colors because it's more of a step function versus a continuous change. However, because they're in mini skeins, you have more control over how you use those colors. You can mix them up and not go in order, or you can decide if you're making a pair of socks exactly where you want those colors transitions to happen and have control over where those color transitions take place. And I think that this is really just one little reason in a comparison that is very, very similar for why you might want mini skeins or why you might want a sock blank. And different knitters and crocheters may have different preferences over the type of yarn that you want to use. And I suppose it's a question similar to, would you rather buy a self-striping yarn or buy multiple colors to create your own stripes on a project? It's really a matter of preference. So with your mini skein sets, you have a lot of control over where your color transitions are going to happen, but you have more ends to weave in. With an unraveled sock blank, especially a double-stranded sock blank, you'll have 2 matched 50-gram balls of yarn, so those color transitions will happen in the same places if you're making 2 socks or 2 mittens or something like that, without you needing to do any type of planning. But I think that if you have a sock blank and you realize you're not going to be using all of that yarn on a sock, and you're like, oh, this is a rainbow gradient, I want to get some of that purple in there, then you might need to cut the yarn and play around with that more. Whereas if you have mini skeins, you can make sure you get all of the different colors in your project a little easier. But anyway, these are just a few reasons why you might pick one over the other. One other difference is that even though we can have tonal variation on these minis, we could get some glazing on here, and if I pull it apart, you can see some light areas in there. Those would be reverse speckles, and so things will be a little bit more mottled, a little bit more variegated coming out of the blank. And so that could be another reason why you decide to dye mini skeins versus dyeing a blank. And certainly you could use 10-gram mini skeins to get even smoother transitions, so you can get more intermediate colors along the way, so that way it is a smoother gradient. The pink blanks turned out so fun, and these blanks themselves are not as much of a comparison of one of the mini skein sets, but it's really invoking the whole color mixing scheme. And throughout here, because we dip dyed into pink, with more pink down there, less down here, we dip dyed into black, with more of our black there, and almost none up here. I feel like almost every single color that we have up there is represented here in this blank, and that's a lot of fun. We also ended up with a surprising amount of consistency between the 2 different blanks that I dyed. And I will be unraveling one of them so you can get a feel of that variegated color progression from the unraveled yarn, because as you go across each row, you're going to have a gradient similar to, I guess, what you would have in one of the 5 mini skein sets. But just the pink is going to transition slower and get more and more saturated. As for our yarn mops, a bunch of them match some of the colors pretty well that we had mixed with our mini skeins. But then we had 2, one with all those leftover blues and one that I used while dyeing the sock blanks that are their own unique tonal color and are still quite beautiful. Phew! A lot of work went into this video, and I really hope that you appreciate it. I had so much fun finally getting these shades of deep magenta and Caribbean blue, and I know I'm going to refer to these images a lot because I already refer to the other similar images that I've created all the time, and so these are going into a resource folder that I have. You don't need to actually dye yarn to play around with color mixing. You can do it in just cups of water or even on a paper towel. But there are some pigments that look different once you've applied heat and acid than they do when they're dissolved in water. So I find it really helpful to go all the way to dyeing the yarn. But you can definitely make mini skeins that are smaller than 20 grams or 10 grams that you can buy commercially. And that can be a good cost-saving way to play around with the color mixes without needing as many materials. And if you want to color mix with a different red or blue than what I've shown in those reference photos, you can definitely use them as a jumping off point to help you narrow down the proportions that you might want to start with, and then you can tweak things as needed to get that color that you want. Because not all reds or blacks have the exact same amount of pigmentation, so you may need to play around with the recipes a bit, but again, I refer to these all the time. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and are there any other shades that I should play around with for color mixing? I know I should probably do the primary red and blue, but again, I feel like we have something that's pretty close, and so for now, that's probably okay. Now, I do have more color mixing videos coming up on the channel, and I actually do have a whole playlist dedicated to color mixing. So if you want to go and see some of those other projects, you can. And while you're checking out the ChemKnits tutorials channel, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I post content at least twice a week over here, and sometimes even more frequently when we're doing a special series like the Spring Mini Skein mini series. Right now, I have nightly videos. There's gonna be 4 videos this year focusing on mini skein dyeing, a bonus colorway, and then a behind the scenes vlog where I will talk about everything from making the extras for the mystery yarn that I shipped out to thoughts about the dyeing projects. And this year I even have a little bit of footage from some of my thought process during the editing process. We'll see how long the vlog is, but each of these videos will air as a premiere, and I'll be hanging out in the live chat room with all of you. And this is so much fun, and honestly, where things like yarn lasagna were coined, and so I really enjoy doing series like this, and I hope you do too. So again, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I mentioned mystery yarn. There is still some yarn available from the SMSMS series. We have some mini skein sets. We have some yarn mops and bonus skeins, and even sock blanks that were dyed in some of the videos. Now, there isn't currently an option on the listing for you to pick which night your yarn comes from. You pick the yarn base and then the colorway is a surprise, but you can go ahead and ask if I have a particular night available, and I can let you know. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any of those questions. But now I hope you're really excited to see what's gonna come out tomorrow night for the Spring Mini Skein mini series night 3. It's so hard to not share spoilers of these videos in advance, and so I can't wait for you to see it. Thank you so much for watching.